So I finally got my PS5. I had to kill 3 men to make it happen, but it was worth it, I guess. I don't know. I just finished playing through the Yuffie Dlc for FF7R, and as someone who has made like hours and hours worth of video essay content hyper-analyzing the gameplay mechanics and design of FF7R and other videos, I figured I'd talk about it for a little bit. The writing of the Yuffie Dlc still generally sucks in the same way that the writing in base FF7R sucks. The dialogue is horrible, nothing feels even remotely authentic or genuine, everything anyone says or does feels like it's being forced into the scene. Actually, this DLC has a new problem with tone that base FF7R didn't, and that's the incredibly strange music choices all over this small segment. You'll be watching some scene that if it had no music, it would just be a normal scene, where characters just like explain very basic normal information. But they put these weird fucking tracks on way too loud, way too immediately, like some happily ever after, true meaning of Christmas, best friends forever, just weird ass music will be playing without being earned at all by the scene, and it's just odd. The music threw me out of the game, like probably a good 30 times or more, just in this small section. It's just that weird. The music doesn't feel even remotely like the music they had throughout the base FF7R, except for in the combat. Like, the boss fights still have music that sounds like FF7R music. It's just the cutscenes that are just bizarre. I wouldn't normally even complain about such a little aspect of tone, but the music is so aggressive and so weird, I can't ignore it. I'm watching a scene and the music is just throwing me off so hard. I don't even know if the music is awful or not. I don't even know how to judge it, but it's just incredibly strange to experience and pretty off-putting. It's so corny out of nowhere. Like, in a scene that I don't even know how it's being corny about it, because it's just nothing. But then I'm not even supposed to sure what I'm supposed to gather from it. But yeah, anyways. The characters mostly all act like weird sock puppets. Yuffie especially is terrible in this. Yuffie doesn't come across like an eccentric, energetic young girl. She comes across like a schizophrenic who is randomly being possessed by a demon to say incredibly strange shit and make weird-ass, illogical body movements and body language that is completely detached from the situation and from normal reality. One thing I wished I'd mentioned back when I was talking about FF7R's writing, and I brought up this point briefly on the weird-ass, the really strange character animations and cutscenes, and the totally inhuman body language, is the aspect of the suspension of disbelief and cartoonification, because obviously the characters in the original FF7 have, like, these big cartoonish movements with their, like, slow poly-count character models, where they're like, oh, doing jumping jacks and shit. As I've talked about before in other essay videos, a cartoon, by definition, is sensory abstraction, or narrative abstraction. Like a circle with 2 dots for eyes is an abstract representation of a human face, which is obviously much more visually complex than that. Anything that is abstract is, by definition, a cartoon. Abstraction results in very specific psychological influences if you're watching it. It's easiest to explain with, like, live-action anime adaptations. Like that god-awful Cowboy Bebop live-action thing that happened recently. If you take a scene from anime, especially like a particularly cartoonish anime where there's a lot of abstraction, like high-energy, goofy faces, silly gags, that sort of shit, you know, and you copy and paste it, but in live-action. Like, if you took a scene from One Piece where a character's, like, face is contorting and their eyes are, like, popping out of their heads like a mile, and you, like, tried to replicate it or, like, had characters doing similar actions in, like, a live-action sense, it won't work. The fact that it was abstract is what made people accept it in the original. It's what suspends people's disbelief for what they're watching. When they see something that is realistic, definitely not abstract, but it's still acting in a weird, unbelievable way, it just feels wrong. Such is the case for the overt body language and the extreme stereotypical fucking, like, autopilot anime personalities the characters in FF7R have, especially Yuffie, again, who is just, like, a cardboard cutout of a fucking dumbass anime character. Like, all of her personality traits in every interaction in a scene just feels like it's being ripped out of a fucking, what do you call it, what's that website that tells you all the tropes and what they're thinking? TV tropes, that's what I'm thinking of. The graphics and the presentation are much less abstract than the original FF7, which was very blocky and it had an abstract representation of combat through turn-based stuff and so on, and didn't have voice acting. You know, when we see a realistic-looking Yuffie still acting like a complete fucking lunatic, not like an energetic kid, but like genuinely behaving this inhuman way no real person could ever behave. Not even like a fake extreme personality anime human could ever behave. Saying weird-ass lines that barely, if even that, barely fit the context of the situation when she says it. Horrible attempts at body language that also just don't fit and don't make sense in the context, where she's just like weirdly... It's just weird and off-putting. It's horrible. Again, this all contributes to a story where I can't take anything seriously because nothing feels genuine. I don't believe anything I see. I don't believe a person would act this way and say these stupid fucking lines and make these weird-ass gestures. I can't buy into any of it. My disbelief is not suspended. It all feels completely fake. It all feels like these characters are just being forced out of nowhere to say and act and do really weird things to ham-fistedly pretend like they're eccentric. Therefore, I can't take the serious scenes seriously either, because I've never seen any of these characters as authentic or believable at all. One thing I complained about briefly in my older videos in criticism of the concept of FF7R expanding the world of FF7, quote-unquote, it actually gets way worse in this DLC, to the point where it's a genuine problem. You know, I was previously just using this as an example of laziness and a lack of creativity on the devs' part, and showing the fact that they are not actually expanding the world. They're not actually coming up with their own new ideas to fill anything with. And that's the issue with the character designs. The NPCs and random Midgar citizens look so massively different from the way that Yuffie and Sonon dress. The cutscenes just become mind-numbingly idiotic to watch. You're watching a scene of these, like, fucking drab, gray, and beige normal-dressing losers, and then these two bullshit anime characters with their insane, gaudy outfits, and no one is noticing them. They literally just act like they're just another couple people in a crowd. They're in the Shinra building, where all Shinra employees we ever see across the game look basically identical to each other, but then we're expected to believe no one sees these fucking Comic-Con dipshits walking around and think that they look weird. Everyone just assumes, oh, those are normal Shinra employees. It's baffling to watch. Also, I mean, I like Yuffie's design and Sonon's designs in this. I just think that it's a problem with, like, again, they aren't taking the fact that people in this universe should dress in these eccentric ways because we're led to believe that our characters dress in these ways, and expanding that to the NPCs. They just don't dress or look like anything, which is really shitty and lacks any imagination and creativity, and also makes it look fucking retarded when shit like this happens. Also, all FF7 spin-offs are embarrassing, and tying in fucking Deep Ground into this game's canon has to be the dumbest thing you could possibly do as a writer/director, but whatever. The whole series is one big joke in terms of story, due to how much of they insist on using actually, like, nightmare-level terrible ideas from the shitty spin-offs. Not only did they have to be dumb enough to write these awful spin-offs in the first place, these same fucking idiots, they have to be even dumber all this time later, all these years later, to still think that those shitty ideas and those shitty stories are, like, worth bringing back and forcing into this remake series. It's nuts. How can a team be this wrong about everything they think and do? How can they be this bad at writing on, like, a macro level, at making basic decisions? Whatever. The story basically doesn't even matter at this point. No one cares. The universe and lore is such a jumbled mess of different retcons from different awful spin-offs and different new bad ideas. It doesn't even matter, man. This whole DLC doesn't even matter. Like, nothing is accomplished in this story. Nothing happens. Yuffie meets this guy, Sonon, she's never met before, I guess. Then he dies. She's already experienced war and trauma and stuff before in her life, so that's nothing new for her. So, like, nothing changes from beginning to end. Her personality is still the same in the end. It could only be argued that this story matters because it shows Yuffie, like, this arc of Yuffie becoming more sympathetic to the citizens of Midgar. But that's not kind of, like, weirdly enough, that's not even, like, a focus or a big through line. The emotional focus is weirdly enough on Sonon, this character that doesn't matter and won't matter again. They just introduced these awful characters from those awful spin-offs, like fucking Weiss. There's not enough satisfying through line to this story. You know, there isn't a satisfying through line to this story. It's not like a good, like, self-contained narrative here where you can just enjoy it by itself. There's nothing long-lasting here either that would matter in the future, so it's just like a simple excuse side story just to have Yuffie gameplay, and the story basically means nothing. And how is the gameplay? Well, I do wish there was more of it. We don't get like a Corneo Cup like in the base game. We just get the simulation boss fights to redo, and we don't get that many of those. And weirdly enough, there wasn't that much actual combat in this DLC. I probably spent more time spending like my level up points and looking through my menus after each fight than I did actually fighting most enemies, because you level up so quick. There's a couple of short encounters with small numbers of jobber enemies that are basically meaningless, completely forgettable experiences, and then there's a few mini-bosses and bosses. Actually, that was a complaint that I had in the base game, if you recall. If you watch my long-ass, 3-hour video on the gameplay of FF7R, I said, near the end of it, that it weirdly didn't have enough content to feel satisfying. Like, there's so much more in the game's mechanics that I wanted to try out and have the opportunities to try out, and, different scenarios that might occur that would lead to interesting situations. Different mechanics and moves and pairings and magic and such, but there just aren't enough different fights in the game to feel like it really makes you explore all the systems. This is even more so true for this DLC. The game still desperately needs more enemy types, more combat situations with different enemy pairings, or structured like waves of enemies. That's still something they haven't done, waves of enemies. More scenarios with certain mechanics like poison and other status effects are widely underused in the base game and this DLC, to the point where it's weird that there are even mechanics in the game at all. They just appear like 1 or 2 times in these very specific segments. You just need 10 times more actual different combat scenarios and different enemy groupings to feel like there's a satisfying amount of unique situations to play in, or like you've even used all the game's systems to a decent degree by the end. But in terms of the actual mechanics, there's only so much they could do to fix some of the problems from the base game. I understand that. They can't completely remake the existing enemies and their attack patterns and behaviors and such. Problems that existed in the base game with enemies, certain enemies, not having clear animations for what attack they're about to do, like some of the flying enemies and so on, or clusterfuck encounters where it's hard to keep track of the positions and actions of all the enemies at once, and other things. Those are all still problems that could not have been solved in this DLC. I will say, there are fewer bullshit clusterfucks, and only really, the clusterfuckiness I felt was in situations where I wanted to attack one enemy, but the soft lock target would go after someone else. I'd be fighting the projector boss fight, and Yuffie would swing at the invincible projector, and I didn't want her to. I wanted her to swing at the gross, whatever it's called, because it's awkward to use the lock-on and switch targets as you want. The lock-on gives you a really bad camera angle, so I tend not to use it a lot of the time. But like I said, there were fewer annoying clusterfucks than I found in the base game. I think this is because they got better at structuring their combat encounters. They don't put you in as many combat encounters where super mobile enemies with, moves that don't give you a lot of tell or clear anything go on. There's a boss fight where there's so many, near the end of this, the final boss fight of the Yuffie DLC is this thing where there's so much particle effect bullshit going on you can barely see what's happening half the time, but it doesn't really matter. It's still easy, and it's still generally you can kind of understand the important things that are happening. And the game also gives you better crowd control tools in this DLC, so that helps clusterfucks as well. I'm not real. Also, Sonon, I didn't pay attention to him that much. There were a couple of instances, again, clusterfuck instances that I recall, where it's I would look down at the screen and Sonon has really low health all of a sudden, and I don't know when it happened or why. You know, that would happen a lot in the base game, where you're just when the fuck did this happen? I didn't even see anything happen, because so much shit is happening in the environment without giving you very clear information. You know, the only time you'll really know that big damage has happened to one of your party members that you didn't directly see is if the screen starts glaring red because they get super low on health. But, whatever. I'm not really a fan of Sonon gameplay-wise. I don't like his inclusion very much. I don't like his assortment of ATB moves, particularly. The only thing I like about him is the synergy moves that Yuffie gets with him, but that's more like Yuffie doing moves that just happen to have Sonon with her. You know, it's from Yuffie's position. But Sonon as a unit, I didn't find him fun to do or input anything for. But those are my only real complaints. A lot was done to improve some of the issues that the base game had. It feels like Yuffie's dodge actually has some speed and maybe invuln to it. I don't know if that's because they changed the dodge with Yuffie, or it's because they changed the tendencies of some of the attacks the enemies have to not hit you while you're dodging as much and have these wonk-ass tracking and hitboxes. You can actually dodge attacks in this, which is nice. I think they went a little overboard with giving you too strong of defensive options in this, though. Yuffie has a just defend mechanic, where if you just defend, if you block at the right time, you negate all damage from an attack and even deal stagger to the opponent that you blocked. Her weapons also have upgrades that grant her buffs whenever she does this. And it's generally... what's the word? How do you say this? Incredibly fucking broken. I can get health regen for a single Just Defend. I can get Barrier and Mana Ward at the same time for one Just Defend, which you can get constantly. It's very easy to get. Just Defending even lets you block unblockable attacks. It is super broken. Yuffie is straight up unkillable in this. Yuffie also has an ATB move that is a broader and more loose parry with more active frames for the parry and invincibility that refills itself with ATB if you parry something with it. And that's broken too, since you can just keep looping it against rapid attacks and projectiles and such, and it really helps you with ATB assist materia, since you can cancel it into other ATB moves and get the ATB assist boost for Sonon's ATB. The game is still, highly unbalanced. Magic attacks are still mostly useless. I never casted a single offensive spell in the entire DLC, just the occasional healing magic, and even then, Chakra and Prayer and Yuffie's broken-ass Just Defend buffs do most of the work for you with no resources spent. It's still a highly unbalanced RPG, since the resource management is basically non-existent, since you pretty much never have to spend resources. Nor are you even really rewarded for doing so. Like, I already detailed all the problems with the resource management in my old videos. But hey, Yuffie's defensive, broken moves help to remove a lot of frustration from some situations that would probably be much more annoying if she didn't have these defensive abilities. You can always cancel your attack strings, like your normal attack strings, into a Just Defend and into a parry, which also has Just Defend properties. And even if they are insanely overpowered, they're still satisfying and fun to do, so I'm fine with it. Yuffie as a whole, I think, is almost perfect in gameplay. She's versatile at everything. The only thing I dislike about her in gameplay is her assortment of ATB moves. I don't know, there are some moves that I never used. I didn't use her cannonball attack with Sonon. I'd never used Steal or Mug, so I don't know if those have more practical value, because I assume Steal at least would just work like it does in the base game, which I didn't care about much at all, since I was never going to use items in the game anyways. But those would have given her more moves to pull off, which would have helped one of her problems, which is, when I'm using ATB Assist or Skill Master, which are vital to the game actually being its top level of fun and top level of strategy. You know, you have to have ATB Assist and Skill Master for the game to really, make full use of its mechanics. I don't have that many moves to even use with Yuffie for Skill Master. I can cancel Art of War into itself to trigger ATB Assist for 2 moves back-to-back, but that's a waste since I want to do 3 different moves to trigger Skill Master, not 2 of the same moves back-to-back. I don't have a ranged attack other than the big magic explosion move that I want to charge up and save it for a big hit. So my only real moves to use in most gameplay once I'm already in the ninjutsu I want, which lasts for a really long time, is just the Art of War and the Whirlwind one, the first 2 attack ones that she starts with. The combo moves that's with Sonon do not, for some reason, they do not count as different ATB moves according to Skill Master. If you do Art of War and you do Synergy Art of War, they count as the same move, according to Skill Master, which I find a little strange, but it's, fine. I wish Yuffie had just, one more generally useful ATB move to do in ordinary situations, and that would help her use Skill Master a lot better. In terms of information communication, I love that they added an icon and extra startup on unblockable moves. That's great. I wish they added an indicator that I asked about for Skill Master, so you know what's currently on the docket for it, but whatever. Maybe next time. Let's see, Yuffie's big-ass explosion move is extremely satisfying to do, and having a move like that builds up with other ATB moves over a single fight is clever, and it's a great way to add more nuance to the existing ATB system. I'm not the biggest fan of Yuffie's regular attacks, her non-ATB attack, because I feel that everything I do does about the same amount of damage and builds about the same amount of ATB, so I don't really care if I'm doing like ninjutsu blasts or point-blank melee strikes or retreating with projectiles or lunging at my projectiles and then doing aerial strikes. They all kind of feel like the same thing. Unless the enemy is particularly weak to the element that I'm using ninjutsus for. I also wish that there was more immediate, like a more immediately obvious indicator on screen for when your shuriken is on your person or not. There were a lot of moments where I hit triangle thinking I'd throw the shuriken at an enemy I was looking at, but it was actually still out there somewhere, and instead I lunged to that position. I think Yuffie's mobility with her lunge move and her retreat move she gets by holding square are kind of underplayed and not particularly practical by how the game tends to work. Since they're great and like you have this boss fight and the boss fight sends out drones and you can like air combo and go from drone to drone, so that's a situation where it's obviously very useful. But like since the soft lock is really shitty, the actual lock on is really shitty as well. You can't do the shuriken action from the frozen time either, where you can carefully look at the exact person you want to target. It all leads to situations where ideally, like, oh, I'd want to say throw this shuriken at this specific enemy in the back over there, but it'd be way too much of a pain in the ass to actually make sure that I'm targeting him for this one throw, and then I can't aim my attacks at the other enemies I really want to, and like so on. It's just a constant annoyance. So I rarely got to use my movement during my attacks for my explicit benefit. There were some cases where I used the shuriken recall, like lunge attack, to evade some attacks of approaching enemies, but usually not. Usually I was confused as to what was happening. I also mainly only use the synergy mechanic just when I wanted to do synergy ATB moves, and then I turned it off to generate more ATB on Sonon. Most of the time, I wasn't really motivated to make sure that Sonon was striking the same target that I was, but that's something I probably would have started doing more and strategically implementing it into my game plan if there were more content to play in the DLC. So, overall, lots of big improvements to over the base gameplay. I really didn't have that many annoyances playing the gameplay of this. It's mostly really fun to play. I just wish there was more of it, and large, like, sweeping issues, like the general unbalance of the whole game and the resource management and stuff, they can be fixed in the future. Hopefully Part 2 makes magic not a gigantic waste of MP, and so on. So yeah, Yuffie DLC was pretty fun.